Dark fantasy, or even grimdark fantasy, has become much more popular in the modern age. I wonder why that is. I'd say it's a fair assessment that Tolkien's universe doesn't fit into either of those two categories, but there is some pretty dark stuff in there. It just doesn't often get spoken about because Tolkien didn't focus on it, and with the real terrible stuff he tended to imply rather than explicitly describe. But leaving no stone unturned, I welcome you to a new series, The Dark Side of Middle-earth. In this episode, let's talk about one of the darkest practices of all time, human sacrifice. I think it's pretty safe to say that we, humanity, have made some pretty significant steps in the past few centuries. What I mean is that there's a lot of cultural or legal practices that were once normal that are now seen as barbaric, at least from a Western perspective. Capital punishment has been abolished in many places, slavery is illegal, human and workers' rights have been much more improved, discrimination based on race, religion, sexuality and gender, while certainly still around, is much less prominent, at least for now. And then we have the more extreme practices, stuff like cannibalism and human sacrifice. I think human sacrifice is probably seen as the worst. As a cultural practice, cannibalism is much rarer and is often done due to desperation more than anything else. While human sacrifice usually gets associated with peoples like the Aztecs, and fair enough, they were quite good at it, the reality is that it was practiced all over the world throughout history. That said, it became viewed as barbaric far quicker than some of the other things I've mentioned, and has since become associated with things like dark cults, summoning demons, or appeasing some cruel god. It's not really something you would associate with Tolkien's universe though, and if you have just read The Lord of the Rings, there's absolutely no mention of it. But human sacrifice did exist in Middle-earth, and may have actually been decently widespread at times. We make this presumption because it was a tool of both Dark Lords, Sauron and Morgoth, and was used almost exclusively in their attempted corruption of men. In fact, human sacrifice played a role in what could be described as the original downfall of man, shortly after they first awoke in the far east of Middle-earth in a place called Hildorian. We learn about this in something called the Tale of Adenel, spoken by Andref, a wise woman of the First Age. From this tale, we learn that when men first awoke in the east, they were approached by Morgoth in a fair disguise, although Tolkien later suggested that it might have been Sauron instead. Morgoth convinced the men that the other voice that was speaking to them, that of Ilúvatar's, was actually the darkness, and that only Morgoth could protect them from it. He wins them over by giving them far more information than Ilúvatar does, and expertly uses their fear of a solar eclipse to blame the darkness. He orders them to build a temple and to obey and worship him. We're told that every man in existence bent the knee to Morgoth. Ilúvatar wasn't happy, pronounced the doom upon all men, and afterwards they began to experience their first deaths, and the land and its animals turned against them. Some men realized that they had been tricked and turned against Morgoth, but they in turn were hunted down by those men who remained loyal to him and had earned his favor. We're told that those who were hunted down were then taken to the temple and ritually burned inside. Those who managed to flee would become the ancestors of the Edain and many other groups of men that spread across Middle-earth. Now, the accuracy of this story can be doubted. After all, by the time we hear it, it's several centuries old and has only been passed down through word of mouth. There's almost certainly exaggeration, and there's inaccuracies such as men originally being immortal. But the stuff about human sacrifice definitely isn't beyond the realm of possibility, because we know for a fact that it happened in other places too, and that it happened at the urging of the Dark Lord, Sauron. So our other example is more well known, and that is in regards to Numenor. After Sauron was taken to Numenor as a prisoner, it did not take long before he basically made Ar-Pharazôn his puppet, and started exerting his influence across the entire country. The Numenoreans were already brutal conquerors by this point, but under Sauron they began to worship the darkness, aka Morgoth. Sauron had a giant temple commissioned in Armanelos, and he ended up with many willing acolytes from among the Numenoreans. The first sacrifice upon the fiery altar was the White Tree, Nimloth, but afterwards, Sauron and his servants moved on to humans. Soon enough, there was always smoke rising from Sauron's temple. It's possible that human sacrifice wasn't just taking place on Numenor at this point. Tolkien also talks about the native men of Middle-earth, saying that those who served Sauron also built temples, often in caverns or secret valleys surrounded by dark trees. One such of these temples is found in the Paths of the Dead, but we don't get to see it because it's behind a ominous closed door, the one where Aragorn finds the dead body of Prince Baldur of Rohan. While we don't know for certain if human sacrifices were practiced there, I'd say it's fairly likely, as the Men of the Mountains were devoted to Sauron, and anytime temples are mentioned in Tolkien's work, it's usually associated with something bad. Okay, so now that we have our examples, let's answer 2 more questions. How widespread was it truly, and why did it take place? As for how widespread it is, we can't say for certain because we only have a few examples. If the tale of Adenel is to be believed, then all men would be familiar with the practice, and it may have been normalised amongst those who served Morgoth and later Sauron. That said, human sacrifice is never mentioned in the West's dealings with peoples like the Haradrim and the Easterlings, unlike slavery, which was widespread. If it was practiced, it was probably rarely, and perhaps only by cults specifically dedicated to the Dark Lord. Our evidence suggests that it certainly wasn't practiced in the same way that a group like the Aztecs practiced it. And that leads us to the why, and why it probably wasn't something practiced by average people, the type of person that Sam is thinking about when he sees the dead Haradrim soldier. It's because it was a political tool used by the Dark Lords. When the Numenoreans were practicing human sacrifice, they were doing it because they believed it would give them eternal life. The sacrifices were meant to empower Morgoth, the darkness, and that darkness was supposed to give them strength. But Sauron knew this was bullshit. The real purpose of the sacrifices was to deal with his political enemies within Numenor, like the Faithful. I think the smoking gun for this is that as Ar-Pharazôn's fleet set sail to Valinor, Sauron's servants were sent with orders to seize Elendil and drag him to the temple. With Ar-Pharazôn gone, Elendil was one of the last political forces that needed to be neutralized. This wouldn't have just been applicable in Numenor. In the Tale of Adenel, the ones being sacrificed were those rejecting Morgoth, those who were trying to run away. They were making sacrifices to Morgoth, who was meant to protect them from the darkness, but even if that didn't work out, or if they didn't truly believe that, at the very least, they're still removing enemies and discouraging others from attempting to run away, lest they share the same fate. The same thing probably happened in the White Mountains, and it probably happened wherever human sacrifice existed, in Rhûn, Harad, or elsewhere. I think the other reason was just about normalizing evil. Just because a society commits human sacrifices, I don't think it means that every person in that society is then evil. But I do believe that it makes them more likely to accept evil. In other words, it makes them easier to corrupt. So when Sauron and Morgoth were introducing human sacrifice to their servants, it had the aforementioned political benefit, but I think it was also part of a greater project in getting them to accept other evils, such as working alongside orcs and other monsters, dehumanizing their enemies and making it easier to be cruel to them, and to value strength at the expense of things like empathy and mercy. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it interesting, and for this video I'll allow for you to find it disturbing as well. Human sacrifice is something that really interests me. No, I'm joking, I'm making a joke about how I often say that about the thing I'm talking about at the end of the video. It's awful. I'd argue that cannibalism is actually less morally abhorrent because at least there can be a practical benefit to it. I can't believe I'm making this argument, no one forced me to do it. Anyway, tell me which one you prefer in the comments. Cheers, farewell, and remember, by sacrificing humanity, you sacrifice your own humanity. I'm 14 and this is deep.